have a tripod somewhere if you need
Nah,
it.
it's okay.
We've
Okay.
got one in the truck. So, tell us about how the landforms here.
Uh, Dinosaur National Monument has the most complete geological record of any National Park Service unit. It doesn't have the oldest rocks, but for all the time periods that are in the record, there are 23 of them at Dinosaur, which is more than any other park. And that's good and bad, because the good thing is you have this tremendous sweep of time and this tremendous sweep of environmental change, from being, sometimes you're standing on the ocean floor, sometimes you're standing in a riparian environment, in the terrestrial ecosystems, other times you're standing in the middle of a vast desert that covered huge swath of the western US. And that gives us tremendous diversity of ecosystems preserved in the rock record. The downside is we don't have as much of some exposed as others.
Right.
And so the Mesozoic formations, the ones that are primarily the ones that would have dinosaurs, are restricted mostly to the western part of the park in and around Split Mountain.
Okay.
So you see Dinosaur National Monument is 211,000 acres, but that's not 211,000 acres of outcrop jam-packed full of dinosaur bones, unfortunately. Nevertheless, it does allow us to study a lot of different time periods and a lot of different environments. The monument is very rugged. It's cut into thirds by the Yampa and the Green Rivers. And so you cannot drive north-south across the monument because of the river canyons. They're almost 2,000 feet deep in places. And so to get from point A to point B, you often have to drive all the way around the east or all the way around the west of the monument to get to various places. So it's a little harder to get to than, say, a place like Petrified, where they don't have any rivers, and so there's roads that go from one end of the park to the other, and you can kind of get closer to your field area doing that. So in a sense, Dinosaur is a legacy of rivers, in that the big dinosaur quarry is a river deposit, and today the terrain is sculpted by the Green and the Yampa rivers into the kind of spectacular canyon lands that we see. So the Green River that's over here has nothing to do with the river that deposited the dinosaur bones. That river is as extinct as the dinosaurs contained in it, and it's purely by chance that it happens to be, the modern day Green is so close to that.
And was the Green responsible for eroding it to the point where you can see?
No, the erosion that occurred exposing all of this doesn't really have anything to do with the Green per se.
So it's more rain.
Yeah, it's just kind of general environment and climate.
So, how many different species of dinosaurs have I found?
In the quarry itself, if you look at both the existing and the historic quarry operations, about 10 species of dinosaurs,
Nice.
and 2 species of croc, and no, 2 species of turtle, 1 species of croc, and a few other smaller things.
Wow.
So it's when you go up and see this, it's really spectacular, but you need to realize that it is a biased deposit. So it's biased in favor of dinosaurs. Other components, parts of the vertebrate fauna are not well represented, and even within the dinosaurs, there are a fair number of juveniles known from the quarry, but it's still heavily biased in favor of large individuals. Simply smaller things don't do very well traveling in rivers and getting deposited on the bottoms. And that's just kind of standard fare often for dinosaur deposits. So while people often think of us as a park that manages fossil resources, really what we do is we manage ancient ecosystems.
Yeah.
And so we're interested not just in the bones, but in their broader context. How they relate to one another, the relationships to the sediment, the kinds of sediments they're in, how that deposit relates to other deposits, and how all those deposits relate to the overall geology of the unit. So, the fossils are always the most spectacular part of any of these ecosystems, but the geology is really important in terms of telling us details about environment, climate, environmental change over time, even within an ecosystem. What's the diversity of environments during any particular time that the formation's being deposited?
Right.
So we're interested in preserving both the rocks and the fossils.
That's great. And all the fossils that you find here, do they mostly stay here, or do they end up in museums?
It depends. We have a fair amount of what has been found in the park here, but in 2006, the visitor center up there was condemned with 48 hours notice. We were told to get out of the building, that it was in danger of imminent collapse.
Oh my gosh.
So that was an adventure. And so we had a significant amount of our collections there.
Yeah.
So we had to move those out and then move them to several different places in the interim. And then after about 5 years, we had funding to replace the visitor center. So the building that's up there now, other than the roof and the major structural beams, is completely new. It was all completely torn down. The entire face was enclosed in this gigantic plywood sarcophagus to protect it during construction.
Right.
And then that building reopened in 2012.
Wow.
So we now have less storage space than we had before for a variety of reasons. So there are some larger excavations that have gone on, and the material is still actually accessioned and cataloged into our collections, but they're held in outside repositories, primarily at Brigham Young University at Provo and the University of Utah in Salt Lake City on the Wasatch Front. So they're like 3 hours away, which isn't too long a drive by Western standards.
Right, right.
And both of those places have very large collections facilities. The University of Utah Museum is only opened in 2012. So they really can provide very good conditions for them, and they're easily accessible for people who want to come and take a look at them. So for now, that's where some of that stuff is going. But there's a lot of paleontological work that we do that doesn't involve actually excavating fossils. So we are doing a fair number of projects involving fossil footprints. And so there you might have a huge slab, gigantic slab, half the size of a football field or something,
Wow.
with tracks on it, and there's no way you can collect that.
Yeah.
There's no way you can put a structure over it. Well, there is, but there's no way that that's actually going to happen.
Right.
It's in the backcountry of the monument. So there you do molding and casting of representative parts, photograph it, map it, try to document it as best you can.
Right. And is that what I saw a little
No,
slab
that's,
in
yeah,
there?
that long slab
that
is
was-
from one of our sites. That's a scorpion trail,
Oh, wow.
190 million year old scorpion trail. That's on a huge slab that is impossible to collect.
Right. So that's a mold of it.
So that we did a mold. That's a cast. So
Okay,
that's the
great.
replica. So that's one of the ways, and that's a problem with fossil trackway sites in general, not just the Dinosaur.
Right.
And there are places like Dinosaur State Park in Connecticut where they've built a structure over a big dinosaur footprint locality. It's horizontally bedded, so they've put these really wonderful redwood walkways about 2 feet above the trackway with nice side lighting so the tracks really stand out. But there's lots of places in Europe, there's a number of places with these immense horizons with trackways that are just, outdoors. They're in parks, but there's no way you could build a structure big enough to enclose all of them. Some of them are very, very large and very steep on these vertical surfaces. So
Right.
there's different kinds of approaches depending on what kind of resource, what the nature of the resources that you're working with.
Right. Right. I imagine it would be difficult to deal with as large as this area is.
Right. I was just looking at your questions again this morning. So just a couple, you asked, what do visitors not see when they're here?
Right.
And, like I said, Dinosaur was originally established for the quarry that we're going to see in the very top of the hill.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very specific creation for a very specific site,
Right.
as opposed to, say, Badland or Petrified,
Right.
which was a swath of land created because of all these fossil plants that were scattered across it.
Right.
So when the visitor center closed down in 2006, the visitors could not come and see the resource for which the park was established, which is a real serious problem. It's not like we had a visitor center over a place and we could move it to another place and you could still see the resource.
Right.
So that was part of what was very useful for us in terms of getting funding, because without that building being safe, you endanger the resource for which the park was established, and also people can't get in to see the resource.
Right.
So that worked out kind of well. The other thing is that the other major resource for the park is the river systems and the associated fauna and flora of that. And
Right.
that is difficult to see other than a few places where there are hiking trails and you can look down on it.
Mm-hmm.
The only other way to really see it is to do a river trip.
Right.
And there are one-day river trips in the park. The multi-day river trips get you to see more of the river canyons. And if you've never done any whitewater boating, and not very much, it's totally different being down on the bottom of the river and looking at 2,000-foot cliffs
Right.
than being on the top of the 2,000-foot cliff looking at the little dots that are the people on the river. So if you have time, it would take a fair amount of a day.
Yeah.
You drive out the Harper's Corner Road over by headquarters in Dinosaur, and then hike the 2-mile loop trail on the Harper's Corner Trail. That takes you out to a prow of rock, and you're looking down about 1,800 feet down into the river canyons. If you don't have time for all of that, you drive all the way to the end. The speed limit's like 25 or 30, so it takes longer to get to the trailhead than you think.
Right.
And then that's like a 1 mile out, 1 mile back trail with not much altitude gain. It's a little bit up and down, but nothing.
Right.
And you get out to the end of this prow, and it's all fenced in, and you can look out over the Yap and see all these deeply incised meanders. You can see a little bit of the green cutting straight through the rock. Directly across is this huge fault, the Mitten Park Fault, where you can see beds coming up and truncated from one another. You can look down into Whirlpool Canyon. And then if you look at your feet, which is the last thing you're likely to do, you see lots of Paleozoic marine invertebrates in the carbonate, and you're actually standing on a 300-million-year-old ocean floor and looking at the modern day terrain. So it's got great views, and it's kind of relatively easily accessible. So if you had time, you wanted to see it, that would be a cool.
Sounds like that makes the decision
And then
then.
when you look at Echo Park, which is what you're looking down, and Whirlpool Canyon, in the 1960s, there was a huge conservation battle focused on Dinosaur because they wanted to put 5 dams into Dinosaur to flood the river systems to create reservoirs. And those would have been the first dams built inside a National Park Service unit. So there was a big conservation battle. The decision was made not to do them. They put the dams elsewhere. But when you look down into Echo Park in particular and imagine that being completely filled all the way up to the rim, that's would have been what would have happened if they had put the dams in.
Right.
However you feel about dams one way or another, I mean, the terrain would look, radically different. The experience would be quite different.
I think they're great as long as they're not in a national park. I can't imagine. That doesn't seem like the ideal place for them.
Oh no, and when you look at all that spectacular terrain, then you realize none of this would be visible. It's really pretty striking. So, anyway, that would be the other one. One of the things, sometimes people will come here expecting to see a dinosaur exhibit like they see in a museum.
Right.
And when they walk in, instead of seeing mounted skeletons, they see this huge dinosaur logjam. And it's surprising. And, there are lots of museums where you can see dinosaur skeletons mounted. But not many places you can go and actually see these things left in place just as they were deposited. So this is the place where all of that kind of approach started. And in part, it's because the sandstone's very hard. So the preservation of the bone is good. Although it makes it very hard to prepare bones because the rock is so hard. And then the other thing is it's tilted up about 50 or 60 degrees. And so it's really ideal for viewing. You can do something when it's horizontal as well. But if this was like a 30-degree slope, it would be a lot more difficult viewing at a very low angle. So the historic excavations removed an area about 3 times bigger than what you see here off the top of the ends of the building.
Wow.
And then this part was exposed. The 57 building was built basically on the same footprint. And most of the bones you see here were exposed since that time. And we stopped excavating here in the 90s. We pretty much exposed most of the bone. And this is the densest part of the existing quarry. There are bones of all kinds jumped up against one another from all different kinds of dinosaurs of different sizes. But when you look at this, you always need to keep in mind there was this huge other part of it that has been removed.
Right.
And then this physically continues right across the drainage. And there's lots of bone there, so the size of this deposit is actually considerably bigger than the top of this hill. So the sandstone layer that's tilting right over there, brown, looks like that, is this layer. And you can actually walk the fossil discovery trail down to there. There's additional bone that you can see exposed. And that is this sandstone layer more or less unmolested by people. So what you would see over there is kind of what Earl Douglas would have seen when he was walking here. Although there's nothing quite as spectacular as the 8 bones.
Yeah.
But there are strings of bones and limb bones over there that have all been exposed primarily by natural agencies.
Wow. So is there ever any plan for removing any of those or exposing any of those?
No, and the reason for that is the bone that we see there is, there's nothing we see there that we don't already have lots of here. To open up a quarry requires going through a lot of, we just can't go over there and start digging. So there's all kinds of stuff we have to do. Where do we store the things that we find? How, what's the environmental impact of digging in that particular place? And if we don't want to open a hole in a big quarry like this, because then we're not going to put another building up there. Right. So we have to collect it. What do you do with the things you collect? Where do they go? Now, if we went over there and we're looking around and we saw something that looked rare, part of a skull or something like that, we might go in and target that particular bit to get it out. But otherwise, we don't have plans. We have other sites in the park that we're working, either excavations or something like that. And in a way, we don't really want to mess too much with that because you have this whole excavation that went on historically. And back in the early 20th century, they knew this was a river sandstone, and there really wasn't a great deal more concern about that. So there isn't a lot of geological data recorded. So we have that big quarry with little geological data. We have this quarry, which is part of it, where the main bone layer is exposed, but it's still kind of in place in relationship to its geology. And then you go over there and you have this same layer continue, only there it hasn't been messed with at all. And so for doing various kinds of geological studies, it's kind of unique to have that set of different conditions and you can look at that in different ways.
Right. I think it's educationally important too to see it, in various states.
So this is the question that everyone wants to know, where's the skull? So we have one skull that's preserved up there. Unfortunately, it's at the top of the cliff, which is difficult to get to. But it's a spectacular camera source. That's the most common dinosaur in the quarry. It's the big sauropod dinosaurs, the massively Jurassic dinosaurs. And it's in the right side view, and you can see it's connected to the string of vertebrae. And we removed the right lower jaw. I say left, it's exposed to right. We moved the right lower jaw and went underneath and prepared the underside of the skull. So you can't see that. I mean, researchers can see it, but it's not very easy to see here.
I imagine it was really hard to do all the excavation now that I think about it.
Well, when that was going on, we had a movable crane in here that rolled back and forth, so there was a big working platform up there, and they worked that back and forth over many years.
Big leg bones are from.
Well, the one on the right is from Apatosaurus, and the one on the left is from Diplodocus.
Oh,
They're both right. Yes, right femora, and you're seeing them from the backside. And it's convenient that they were buried next to each other like that, because you can see one of them's a lot more massive than the other. And Diplodocus is only about 15 tons, whereas Apatosaurus gets up to around 50. So it's a robust and a gracile sauropod, which seems like a ridiculous turn of a phrase, a lightly built sauropod, but you can see it kind of when you look at those two bones next to one another. And then right over here, I don't know how to point you, but if you come down an angle from those two limb bones, there's a small limb bone and a bulging bone right there. It's kind of
vertical.
pinkish.
Yeah.
Color. That's a juvenile sauropod
Okay.
femur, so it's very small, maybe a fifth adult size or a sixth adult size. And we do have bits and pieces of juvenile sauropod stuff here. It's not uncommon in the quarry, but generally scattered. So there's one small skeleton that was collected here by the Carnegie during their excavations. We have a cast of that in the space below. And so the other odd thing about this particular building is if you look at just square footage, you think you've got a lot of space for exhibits, but in fact, it's not as much as you might think. In part, you aren't going to block up this whole railing with exhibits because you want people to get this kind of sweeping, majestic view. And once people are up here and trying to get oriented and looking at all of this, you don't really want to have a tremendous number of exhibits over here because it's very difficult to compete with this panorama. So most of our exhibits are done. And in fact, the real exhibit here in the building is the quarry face. And so the exhibits we do have try to tell the story of the ecosystem and the animals that are in here. The quarry kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah.
You see this purple fine-grained rock that's really very pliable, broken up into lots of little pieces. And that's claystone and mudstone. It's not the main sandstone that the bones are in.
Right.
And this stuff has a lot less integrity, and that's why it looks the way it does when it's cracked. And it actually is continuing as a wedge for some distance in between the sands and underneath this big bulge of bone. So this is one of our concern areas about, I mean, we don't see a lot of cracks down there below the big hump specimen, but we do have a concern that there's some internal integrity that we need to monitor. So you don't come in one day and the entire thing is slumped down. Not likely to happen, but nevertheless it's a concern. It's something you need to address when you're deciding to manage things in this way.
Right.
And then one of the advantages of all of this in place is you can look at the relationship between the bone and the rock in a lot of detail. And while it's almost all sandstone up there, it's not one layer of sand. There's many layers, there's lots of scouring and redeposition. Details you can't see from this upper gallery. But there would be no way to completely record that if you were just removing things. And that's one of the things that's so great about this site is you could go back and look at these bones and see what the relation is to that kind of complex microstratigraphy that there is in the quarry face. And that's one of the things we want to also address in the photogrammetry stuff is to plot out layers that show all those different microstratigraphic layers for researchers to use. But things that you would normally do with a limb bone is like length and maximum, the mid-shaft circumference, which is usually the smaller circumference gives you an idea of how robust or gracile something is. Well, for most limb bones on here, you can't get measurements around the limb bones because they're just in place. Or things are preserved at whatever angle they came to rest on the quarry, on the floor of the river, and sometimes that's nice and flat. Sometimes they were deposited like this. They're more buried than we're able to safely excavate them. So you can't always see all the features you need to see. That's just kind of the trouble of doing things in place. Nothing is ideal. There are some museums that have actually molded quarry floors before they remove the bones, and then cast that and put that in the exhibits back in the museum to give people an idea of what it looks like if you were at the quarry where the things are collected. So, all of these are different ways of looking at the fossil vertebrate record, and they each have their benefits both interpretively and scientifically. And neither is the solution for every site.
Yeah. So this outer layer must have been deposited later.
Right.
How much later do you think?
Well, the whole sandstone layer that has all these bones is only about 20 feet thick at its thickest. And we know from the historic operations, so the original discovery was 50 feet above the top of this cliff.
Wow.
So we know this is the main bone layer within that sandstone. But how long this whole sandstone took to deposit is very difficult to estimate. It's short duration. Some guesses may be around a century or a few centuries. It's not tens of thousands or millions of years. As as impressive as it looks, it's really just a very narrow, thin sandstone layer in a very thick formation. But there's no way at rocks of this age to even if you could get the right radiometric dates, if you could get a date from the very bottom of the sand and a date from the very top of the sand, the error bars in that dating are such that they'd overlap and wouldn't tell you anything anyway. Yeah. And we don't have any datable minerals in here to make life even more complicated. So people have grappled with this one way or another, trying to estimate exactly what's going on. And it's hard to do that, but nobody, like I said, you're looking at the order of maybe a few centuries.
Yeah, that's not very much.
That's not very much. So there's more than one deposition event there, but essentially these things are, in a geological, paleontological sense, they're essentially almost contemporaneous.
Right.
So we don't see any, evolution where things in the upper part of the sandstone have changed from things in the main surface of the sandstone. It's just not much time. Which is always the other interesting thing about geology is the amount of time that you deal with when you look at the terrain.
Yeah, I would have thought for that thickness it would be a longer amount of time, but
in a river system, you can get a lot of deposition at one time. It may come down later, high flow, scour it out, and redeposit it. But rivers tend not to stay in their same path for tremendously long amounts of time. In most cases, they're moving back and forth. And then this is juvenile of Dinosaur. So this is the really nice juvenile that was collected here by the Chure Museum. The original is on exhibit in Pittsburgh. And this is the cast. This is the same species as that big thigh bone. So this is the thigh bone in this juvenile, which is about a third of adult size. So this is only about 15 feet in length, something like that. It's still bigger than 90% of the mammalia, but it's still pretty small for a sword. How old is it? We don't know. These are probably about a meter long when they're hatched.
wow.
So it's a juvenile, but it's not really, it's not hatched.
Oh, fell down. That is amazing.
And then the other things you can do with dinosaurs, you can't do a lot of other cancer parts is we have a place where you can actually go up and touch these bones. And in part that's because, go ahead. In part because the rock is very hard, and the bones that just happen to be exposed here are pretty durable limb bones and things that don't have a lot of delicate parts that can be broken off. And most fossil sites, even where they're preserved in a place like that, you can see them, but you can't actually touch them.
Right.
So you can have kind of much more personal experience with the rock and the bone here. You can have a similar one if you go down on the Fossil Discovery Trail. But these are nicer bones to touch. And this has been here, this was all here when I got here in '79, so for been a very long time. You've been able to come up and touch these bones and actually think about them.
Oh, fell down. Now, that is amazing.
And then the other things you can do with Dinosaur, you can't do a lot of the other cancer parts is we have a place where you can actually go up and touch these bones. And in part that's because, yeah, go ahead. In part because the rock is very hard, and the bones that just happen to be exposed here are pretty durable to limb bones and things that don't have a lot of delicate parts that can be broken off. And most fossil sites, even where they're preserved in a place like that, you can see them, but you can't actually touch them.
Right.
So you can have kind of much more personal experience with the rock and the bone here. You can have a similar one if you go down on the Fossil Discovery Trail. But these are nicer bones to touch. And this has been here, this was all here when I got here in '79, so for been a very long time. You've been able to come up and touch these bones and actually think about them.